Everyone knows manufacturing consent, but 2 years before that came out, there was a book by Michael Parenti called Inventing Reality. The 1986 release was an explanation of the machinery of the news media and the bias it naturally produces. It's meant to explicate the coercion of advertising, the natural corruption of mass ownership, debunk ideas like objectivity, something which journalists purport to practice, even as they faithfully echo the established political vocabularies. Like manufacturing consent, this was an attempt to distill the systematized bias of the news media into a single text. Because somehow, despite the archetype of the pugnacious muckraker weaponizing their notebook to expose the corrupt, journalists have this annoying habit of laundering the most psychotic impulses of US empire into neatly packaged stories that sell Americans ideas like poor people are lazy, or protesters are too violent, or bombing poor people overseas will somehow aid in the defense against communism. And actually, let me start with that one. Today, anti-communism is nowhere near the unifying idea it once was. Even the fifth filter of the propaganda model was changed from anti-communism to the war on terror or fear, and I would say it's easier to just call it ideology now. However, it can always be dredged up when needed, and in places like Brazil, actually, anti-communism is much more present. But it wasn't that long ago that a fear of communism was a dominant one in the US. After a century or so of propaganda from the press and the other dominant institutions of the society, anti-communism permeates the American political culture. Communism is a fear word eliciting, without benefit of explanation or definition, a negative response from millions of Americans. For instance, President Reagan's repeated pronouncements about the belligerent nature of what he called the Soviet evil empire, well publicized and unchallenged by the mainstream media, had a discernible effect on public opinion. The New York Times CBS poll in April 1983 found by a 3-2 margin the public backed Reagan's view that the USSR was a growing threat and an immediate danger. Parenti devotes a large portion of the book to anti-communist sentiment, its history, its purpose, headlines written by uncritical reporters who have fully internalized anti-communist propaganda, which naturally leads to uneven coverage of victims abroad based on their utility to the dominant narrative. For 20 years or more, successive famines in Ethiopia and other African nations were given only perfunctory media attention. The famine of 1984 and 1985, one of the severest, which gripped at least 12 nations in Africa, was again afforded slight play, except for Ethiopia, which, now an avowedly Marxist-Leninist nation, became the focus of a new hype not seen since Polish Solidarity days. Here, supposedly, was a communist regime that could not or would not feed its people, a favorite media theme. When famine can be turned into an anti-communist story, it becomes big news. Anti-communism being the dominant ideology at the time, this being 1986, it would be difficult to compartmentalize its explanation and leave it out of the greater discussion. So it's laced through the book, which I suppose is unavoidable, but it ties in with the criticism I have, which is that at times the chapters blend together a little bit. There were passages through the book that felt like they could have fit just as easily in other places. Now, one of the big strengths of the book is the way he presents explanations for the very existence of the damaging ideas the media promulgates. This is why it's a more self-contained guide to media bias. For example, when discussing McCarthyism, he gives a couple pages on Joe McCarthy himself and his relationship to the media, how reporters had to be careful and how they criticized him. It had to be from still an anti-communist perspective. As oppressive as McCarthyism was, its target was shared by a lot of people. So in criticizing McCarthy, reporters would write things like, "McCarthy's playing right into the hands of the communists." Now, in keeping with this, often before explaining the bias with which something is covered, he'll give some time to the root of that issue. And this sometimes means indicting capitalism itself. While the poor are always with us, for the media it is the middle class to which America belongs. The middle class is implicitly virtuous because it's seen as the repository of stability and order. Thus, on CBS Evening News, anchorperson Dan Rather referred to the $17,000 to $41,000 range as the great middle class, the glue that holds society together. The press does not link poverty, instability, and disorder to the injustices and irrationalities of a capitalist system. And it's the last line that's so emblematic of his attitude as a writer. You could technically have a voluminous takedown of corporate media without periodically reminding readers of the original sin of capitalism itself. But I would imagine he would probably say that you can't really. He sees an explanation of the capitalist project as crucial to explaining media bias because, as he explains, capitalism's only real goal is obviously to accrue capital. This will necessarily be at the expense of many people for the benefit of a few people. As he quotes Adam Smith, civil authority is in reality instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor. So if government is a function of capitalism, and given the ties between government and media in sourcing, the relationships that have to be maintained to assure an even flow of news, the journalists who come to have not adversarial but friendly relationships with the government. I mean, high-profile media workers and government officials, their kids go to the same schools. Ben Bradley of the Washington Post, who was played by Tom Hanks in the movie The Post, had a close relationship with the CIA. He once killed a story about the CIA training the Contras in Nicaragua because, as he said, it wasn't news, since the president knew it was happening. To give a dated example, media funded directly by the government, of course, lacks fundamental independence. NPR and PBS work almost exactly as corporate media does, with the exception that they trade advertising dollars for federal funds. Take news workers themselves and the wealth that being in media naturally leads to, the higher up the ladder one goes, which means the most influential people in the media will be the most disconnected from the life of an American with average means, and thus more inclined to defend the status quo that has worked so well for them, and less inclined to seek systemic overhaul. So if you have media operating in support of the government, which is a function of capitalism, then mainstream media is just the PR department for capitalism itself. And this is to say nothing of the fact that media companies are profit-seeking entities to begin with. So with that in mind, how can a theory of media be constructed without a critique of capitalism? Capitalism has no loyalty to anything but its own process of capital accumulation. No loyalty to anything but itself. Anyone who knows anything about Michael Parenti knows that he is a leftist, he is anti-capitalist, and this book is very explicit in that. Of course, almost all serious media criticism is told from the left, but these indications of his personal leanings are everywhere. He writes that the news media have little to say about how socialism improves the lives of people in impoverished lands and how capitalism causes or aggravates their impoverishment. Which of course I agree with, but occasionally it feels a little like he's complaining as opposed to explaining. That's not even really a criticism. I enjoy his writing. There's a frustration with the media that's there that I don't think you can detect in Manufacturing Consent at all, really, despite it obviously being very adversarial. But it is there in Inventing Reality. But it's his conversational and sardonic writing that makes this readable and even entertaining. In relation to the state, the press remains like the adolescent who wants both more input into family decisions and more independence from them. As usual, the press sees no contradiction between its professed dedication to objectivity, telling it like it is and letting the chips fall where they may, and its professed dedication to cooperation and responsibility, suppressing troublesome stories. Political leaders, however, do see a contradiction and refuse to trust the press completely, even though they are willing to use it as much as possible. So the press remains the restive adolescent of a seemingly ungrateful parent, never totally independent nor totally trusted, and denied both complete autonomy and full partnership. The idea of objectivity and independence for journalists is one of our most beloved American fictions, and the number of personal accounts of editors and owners asserting control is alone worth the read. It's always enlightening to get the view from hamstrung journalists who want to tell important stories in the public's interest, but they have to avoid offending advertisers or owners or editors because most journalists are not rich people on TV who absolutely could say anything, to the extent that any TV news anchors are journalists. But if someone on primetime cable news wanted to do regular segments on, why we want to cut our military budget by half, they might not last long there, but they could go and start a Substack and still probably maintain a 7-figure income. But the average journalist, under the constraints of their job, have different experiences. From the book, quoting a New York Times correspondent reporting on Turkey, the suppression of civil liberties in Turkey, the brutal treatment of peasants by a ruthless gendarmerie, the official support extended to the extreme right wing have no place in the columns of the New York Times. Further, I cannot remember any anti-Russian news from any sources in Turkey that has not been published in the Times. especially news depicting Russia as Turkey's enemy and the menace to Turkey's existence. Journalist accounts of why they were passed over for promotions, fears of being fired, self-censorship, as he quotes one editor saying, "It is not what the executive will do or will veto, but what we expect that he will do or veto." That's his influence. Daily censorship is made unnecessary by the anticipatory responses of self-censorship. There are too many to cite, but I think it's a particularly illustrative passage and goes a long way to dispelling this myth of objectivity, because in addition to the systemic reasons laid out in the book, reasons that don't usually include censorship, he also offers a look behind the curtain to reveal actual censorship and actual self-censorship. Inventing Reality is a great book, and it's definitely worth reading, but here's a question I'm interested in. If it came out first and does a great job of explaining media bias, why did Manufacturing Consent become the preeminent text on media bias and Inventing Reality was relegated to leftists with an already conceived political orientation, for the most part? Well, first, Chomsky is way more famous than Parenti, and if it were just Edward Herman as the author, who knows? But often when people use the phrase manufacturing consent, it's just in relation to something they disagree with or see as a lie. So-and-so is manufacturing consent, as opposed to thinking of the propaganda model described in Manufacturing Consent and indirectly described in Inventing Reality, which is essentially the media as a giant Ouija board that just always seems to be spelling out USA #1. But I suppose that's to be expected when dealing with a genre-defining book whose title is so catchy. Now, when people talk about Inventing Reality, I always assume they've read it. Though, when Parenti followers trash Manufacturing Consent, I'm not always so convinced they've read that, or at least read it in good faith, because I struggle to find ideological differences between the books. And granted, I've spent a lot more time with Manufacturing Consent than Inventing Reality, but I can't make sense out of why you would love one and hate the other. Particularly for the fact that Inventing Reality describes everything contained in the propaganda model itself. The model being ultimately why I think Manufacturing Consent won in the end. It compartmentalizes the different components of media bias, and this creates a simple framework for analysis. So you have 5 filters of mass media. You have ownership, advertising sources, flack, and ideology. These filters do a lot of work and they're mutually supportive. That's the model. This is all contained in Inventing Reality, but Chomsky and Herman laid it out for you. And there's also a lot of scholarship on the propaganda model, which of course further perpetuates it. And that being said, with all due respect to Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, Inventing Reality is much more readable. Manufacturing Consent it's a textbook. It's not the most fun thing to read. The tone of Inventing Reality is way less academic, the style is more personal, it's a better reading experience, and all without sacrificing rigor, of course. They both have their strengths. Inventing Reality is more complete in its description of not only news media, but of its relation to the left, and I appreciate his position that corporate media is a function of capitalism. I'm sure that's Chomsky's position and Edward Herman's position too, but it doesn't come out in the same way. And that criticism undergirds Inventing Reality, and the time Parenti takes to walk through the context of what he's criticizing makes for a more thorough understanding of it. For example, where Manufacturing Consent explains how advertising functions as a coercive force in news coverage, Inventing Reality takes more time to actually explore consumerism and advertising's effect on a population. And he does it with characteristic ire. Manufacturing Consent, on the other hand, does a much better job of designing a framework of analysis through the model, and then the subsequent chapters are actually just case studies. The books are mutually supportive. They reference a lot of the same sources. Parenti references Chomsky and Herman a few times. Interestingly, Manufacturing Consent does not reference Parenti. But ideally they'd exist in some sort of synthesized form where the propaganda model were included in Inventing Reality or something, whatever. But certainly to love one and hate the other, I think would be silly, because despite some obvious differences, they have a lot of similar DNA, and both are going to help develop your understanding of how media invents and manufactures reality and/or consent. Linked in the description is where you can read Inventing Reality for free. If you found this video helpful, subscribe. It helps other people find this. And if you want to help me make more of these videos, supporting me on Patreon does go a long way. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.